Welcome to the Continuous Delivery Podcast. My name is Zarar.
I'm Gino.
I'm Cheezy.
I'm Csaba.
Today's topic is how do we reduce bureaucracy on engineering teams, or whether we need to reduce bureaucracy on engineering. Maybe bureaucracy is something you really like. And kind of the motivation behind this topic comes from, engineering is supposed to be a discipline where you sort of, everybody puts their heads down and produces the best amount of work. As agile coaches, we always try to reduce waste. We always try to create sustainable teams. But eventually, as teams progress and age, I guess, collectively, bureaucracy tends to creep in and more process comes into the team. More approvals come into the team's environment where more and more things are needed to get stuff done. And eventually, sort of this friction comes along in delivering software that one day you kind of wake up and you go, oh my God, what used to take us like 2 to 3 days to do now takes 2 weeks to do because of our processes that we ourselves created. It's almost like slow creep of process. It doesn't just happen one day. It sort of accumulates over time. And kind of in this podcast, we kind of want to tackle how do you avoid that situation? What are some of the things you keep in mind to make sure that you don't end up in a situation where your team has high bureaucracy and extremely low throughput? Let's start with Gino on this one, as he's first on the docket.
Okay, thanks. Well, I think we first got to look where that comes from. Where does that bureaucracy come from that you're referring to? And based on the examples that you gave, it almost sounds like the team has stopped challenging themselves. The team has stopped looking at how they can improve, and they just start or continue to work with certain practices, introducing certain checks and so forth, introducing certain activities that made sense at one point, but have stopped making sense. And now they're just doing it because they did this all the time. So while you were explaining the topic, and I was trying to figure out, well, what am I going to say about this thing? I actually was reminded of something related to the objective of why you're doing a certain practice or why you're doing a certain project. And I consider always two particular parameters when you're looking at those things. And that's one is the clarity of your objective, and two is the intentionality with which you are trying to achieve that thing. And I think it's especially the last piece that is impacted when you start using, or when you start having an awful lot more bureaucracy. It's the intentionality of those practices is actually disappearing. We've done them for so long and we kind of forget why we're doing them, and suddenly we feel like we need to do them even though we don't really think about it anymore, or why we're doing those things in the first place. So in my opinion, it's really going back to looking at what those practices are. Why are they there? Is the context in which they were introduced still the same? And maybe we need to do something to look back and challenge our ways of working. So it's really all about that.
Yeah. I mean, Csaba, I'll throw it over to you. But I mean, as you were talking, it reminded me of this team that had started with a definition of done, and they had a little routine where before every sprint started, they used to check their definition of done to make sure that, hey, is this still relevant? And in theory, that sounds like a great idea, right? I mean, let's make sure our DoD is still relevant to what we are doing. But that process of reviewing a definition of done became so routine, so mundane, that it just became like a check that you had to do when the DoD never really got updated or anything. It's just like, okay, everything is good and so on. So Csaba, that's an example of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I just always like to go back. I'm old school to the manifesto, which talks about people and interactions over process and tools, right? And I think this is a great reminder because we tend to believe that it's almost like our human brain try to have this pattern matching machine, and we tend to believe that all these things are the same. All these items that we work on it are very, very similar as a pattern. And it's coming from that production line kind of mindset and thinking, where we just build and churn out features or user stories or whatever these teams is working on, and they are all very similar, very the same. Hence, these processes are going to help us. But in reality, they are very, very heterogeneous. it puts an extra cognitive strain in a way on the team to kind of think about these again and again and again. So I can totally see why teams tend to kind of converge towards trying to build a process or trying to create this, and ultimately the bureaucracy will creep in. And it's extremely difficult, to not do that. But that's exactly the reason that I think as soon as we recognize the fact that we have to give as much power to the team, and this is what we talk about, self-organization, right? To figure those things out and give them the problems. And if they have challenges, and this is I think the key here, if they have challenges to solving these problems, then it's less of a routine. And so the antidote for me about bureaucracy is letting the teams figuring it out, and I hope that's on the long term will prevent these slipping into this routine or into this bureaucracy process.
Cheezy?
Yeah. So when I think about bureaucracy, I see it coming in from potentially a lot of different directions. But, it can come in from management. It can come in from folks who own the infrastructure, wanting the heavyweight deployment processes. It can come in from product folks, wanting to kind of control the team, and so on. But the motivation typically is always kind of the same, which is that we believe that by putting this bureaucracy in place, things are going to be safer. Things are going to run more smoothly, right? And so those of us who've worked in continuous integration, though, what we found is that the bureaucracy over time actually tends to make things less safe. It tends to create handoffs. It tends to create, checks that are manual and so on. And so what I would say, back to one of your original questions, Zarar, when you kick things off, which is how do we work toward maybe not having this bureaucracy? And what I would suggest in this case is to always talk about alternatives to the bureaucracy. Talk about how the bureaucracy itself tends to introduce risk, even though that might be counter to what the folks who are asking for this have seen. I've been involved in many cases where there has been, this discussion around, we can't do that because the bureaucracy itself won't allow us. The auditors won't allow this, or the security people won't allow this, or whatever. But what I found is that setting down and having that conversation around, hey, that's the old way of looking at it, but there are newer ways of looking at it in which we can achieve, many of the same things, and presenting that. I've found that so often that's a way or a path out of some of the bureaucracy.
I've been in situations where indeed, when we're starting up new teams or you're starting up new structure, that people who've been used to those kinds of bureaucracies and indeed, to your point, Cheezy, who feel like if they have a handle, if they know exactly how things work, then things will run smoother. I always give them advice to come up with a minimum viable bureaucracy. And to some degree, there is some structure that is required for larger programs, but you want to keep this as lean as you possibly need to. You want to make sure that each and every thing that you introduce, meeting that you introduce, or activity that you require from your teams, that it at least has a purpose and that people align on what that purpose is. And that for the time being, that's the best way to deal with, to achieve that particular purpose, right? That might change over time as you get better, as you need to align less because you are aligned in mindset and you're able to isolate multiple teams, isolate in a sense that they're not dependent. I mean, so that might reduce the bureaucracy even more. But in order, in the first place, to get something going in a little bit of a larger structure, you might require some of it, right? But always try to figure out what is the minimum viable bureaucracy that I can get away with, right? That would really help.
You know, it's funny because your minimum may be different than from somebody else's minimum.
It's all contextual. And that's absolutely.
And that's really the challenge that I find. But I love the idea. And you know, Csaba, you said something earlier which kind of struck me, which was we tend to apply generalized solutions to specific problems. So if a problem calls for A and B, we might end up with a generalized solution which does A, B, C, and D. So A and B might apply to the problem, but now the team has to do C and D every time to satisfy some one unique thing. So that's how I think waste creeps in. That's how the over bureaucracy happens on teams. And next thing you know, you're overburdened with process.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to just go back a little bit to what Gino said about this minimum viable bureaucracy. I would like to expand it to minimum viable structure. So start your team as small as possible and let the team dictate or ask who else we need. It's a very, I know in especially larger organizations, it's such a foreign concept because they try to staff the team with everyone they possibly need. To your point, this is where you come in. Like if we think that we will need to build A, B, C, D, and E, they will put in place all these people, even though at the beginning of the project maybe we're just building A and B, right?
Yeah.
And so I would go minimum viable structure, minimum viable practice. To this is in a way your bureaucracy, and let the team, again, self-organization, ask for improving that or changing those practices. Definition of that, my favorite, right? Start with the lead, because that's a one piece of bureaucracy that sometimes teams take on. Honest to God, I yet to see a team who can truly have a minimum one and stick to it.
Cheezy, I want to ask you a question specifically. Is that we tend to in companies sort of replicate solutions, right? So, for example, if you have a project or a product that was done by one team, we say, oh, we have to develop another product. Why don't we use the same process that another team had, maybe in the same department or same, and apply it here because that's our process. However, that process may be completely, not applicable to this team or the product. But our organizational muscle is that this is how we work. Therefore, this new team works that way. Is that a particular source maybe for some of the things we're talking about?
I'll just throw out two words: Spotify model, right? I mean, so I mean, we have these ideas that here's a pattern that's going to work in every single condition, even if it's not even a real pattern. Just something that somebody kind of took a piece here or there. Yeah, absolutely. That is a problem. I think part of the root of some of these challenges also is I'm going to throw out a big word: accountability, which is that we tend to spread accountability out amongst a lot of different folks. We have people who are accountable for ensuring that deployments work right, and people who are accountable for making sure that the software works, and other people who are accountable for, so on and so on, as opposed to back what Csaba said a little while ago, which is, where he was talking about self-organizing teams, and taking on the responsibility, but also taking on the accountability, so the whole modern world of continuous delivery, continuous deployment, and layer in this other buzzword, DevOps, which is kind of the same idea, is really about making the people who do the work accountable, and so on. The bureaucracy comes in place whenever somebody else has the accountability for what I'm doing as a developer, for example, or has some form of that accountability, such that they feel like they can impose, steps, processes, checks, whatever, on me. And so anyway, I think getting back to the root where, developers are responsible for delivering the idea that our product folks have, and delivering it in a safe way, and delivering it rapidly, and let that accountability set there is the sure way to try to drive out bureaucracy.
Yeah, I want to marry the two. Like I want to take the idea of separate accountability from separate teams and bureaucracy, because I believe that bureaucracy comes as a coordination cost for accountability. It's when you have so many people accountable, you need another structure over on top of that to make sure that everyone's accountable and there are no gaps and everybody's doing what they can, they're all doing their part properly. It's almost, like you're coming back to almost like a specialization, which we have talked about in a previous podcast, how specialization can yield waste. And here it seems like, you know, in what Cheezy just said, it's almost bureaucratic waste.
Yeah, and then you get into, as an outcome of a retrospective, yeah, we need to do a roles and responsibilities session, right? Because everyone needs to know exactly what they're doing. Oftentimes, I find this to be imposed by the outside, by leadership, right, and not necessarily inside the squad. So I think there's definitely some education required there from leadership, that they really shouldn't care who does what within the squad, that they really shouldn't know what an individual's responsibility is, or who's to blame when something goes wrong. I think there's definitely some education required there, so that the teams can. You said, Cheezy, at some point, we have to make those teams accountable. I tend to want to turn that around and say you have to allow those teams or enable those teams so that they can be accountable, right? Because when we're telling them from the outside who needs to do what, and that everyone needs to have a specific role, and that there's one particular person that will take care of a certain thing and is to blame for a certain thing, then you're actually not allowing them to build that accountability in the first place, right?
Can I just refine just one thing about accountability? I think the accountability is most powerful if it's accountability for the outcomes and not for the output, right? So I think when Cheezy talks about accountability, it's always about the outcomes, because just building widgets itself, again, it's, yeah, we are great building widgets, but how is that impacting our users, right? So I think that's the other aspect where you guys have, when this system has a shared accountability, all they can track is outcomes. Sorry, all they can track is output. There's no real way to track outcomes or to strive for outcomes.
So to make this quite practical, what can somebody do if they find themselves in a place that has a lot of bureaucracy, you know, where there's all of these things being imposed on you from the outside? You know, we believe in Agile, which at its core has this idea of inspect and adapt, right? And so what we can start to do, and I was just working with a team last week to do this, is whenever we have this bureaucracy that's imposed, and we think that there are better ways, and if it's imposed from the outside, what we can start to do is make, you know, a case for why we believe that a lighter weight approach, or maybe an approach that has less bureaucracy, will be safer, or will be simpler, will be faster, whatever it is that the team believes. But we have to continue to try to shed this heavyweightness to try to move more toward lightweight approaches.
Yeah, I'm going to add there, if you have a practice, challenge it on a regular basis, whether that practice still makes sense. Challenge that it solves a real problem that you have. And if it doesn't, get rid of it. If it doesn't do it well, improve it. But challenge the practices that you have.
Yeah, I'd say I think it's very easy to add processes. It's very difficult to remove them. So every time you are adding a rule to the team, I think you should have some sort of a norm which says we should also remove a rule from the team, because we can't just be adding rules and rules and rules. At some point, they'll just blend into just chaos. So I think taking something out when you add something in is something we can explicitly do. The other thing is that we also tend to, again, back to Csaba's point, is that whenever we hit a problem, we try to solve, because we're problem solving, you know, engineers usually like to solve problems right away. They don't want to see waste. But whenever they encounter a problem, they apply a process right away. I'd say wait for a particular pattern to emerge before you solve it using a process. If that pattern emerges, you know, 4, 5, 6 times, and it's similar in flavor, sure, maybe think about doing something different, but don't prematurely solve the problem, because you might be solving something very specific, and the next iteration of that problem is gonna be worse for you because the process you involved did not really consider what the next challenge will throw at you.
One more. Don't introduce a process to replace thinking.
Yeah, nice.
I'm just gonna leave it at that.
So I can go back again to all you guys what said about the single accountability, and I would go back to the accountability of the team, and look for for those situations, or not even look for those situations, but try to make sure that there is really everything can be decided by the team. And in case there is always some kind of an approval or something needed that the team to make this decision, is there any way to maybe slice off a piece of that decision or type of a decision and try to integrate it more and more in the team? The classic example is audit. We probably cannot put everything into the team to make a decision, but perhaps we could help and automate something, right? So then some aspects get kind of sliced out. And so that would be, I think, the reducing bureaucracy is, because teams are always together. They always discuss this. They are very organic. Anytime a decision has to be made from the outside, that's always waste and always wait times.
Well, on that thought, we'll end the podcast. Listener, thank you for listening. You can follow us on Twitter @ContinuousPod, on our LinkedIn group. And also, we now have a YouTube channel where this stuff is posted. So check us out there. The link is in the show notes. Thank you to everybody. And we'll see you again next week. Goodbye.